So I welcome you all. Thanks for coming. I approach today with a little bit of trepidation because anytime we're dealing with apocalyptic or eschatological language, now those two words, eschatology is the study of the end times. Apocalypse means revelation. All right? Apocalypse has nothing to do with, in and of itself, of conflagrations or anything like that. The word simply means revelation. And eschatology deals with the end times. And that's what we're dealing with today. We have in Mark's gospel, this is a kind of a prelude to the establishment of the Eucharist and then Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection. I will do my best to try to clarify, and probably what will happen is I will probably make it more complicated, but bear with me. So let's take a look. We're going to go through, we're not going to do all of chapter 14. We're going to do the second half of chapter 14 next month. But let's take a look at the readings. Now remember, chapter 12 ended up with Jesus cleansing the temple. And the way we understand Jesus' cleansing the temple has more to do with a spiritual cleansing than a physical cleansing. All right? So we open up today, and Jesus is coming out of the temple now. So, as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large building." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." So what we start off with here is Jesus now is referring to the physical destruction of the temple. All right? The words that Jesus uses have the sense of prophetic words. I mean, people are very sensitized to what has been happening throughout Jewish history. A lot of influence from the prophets. So we listen to Jesus and we hear prophetic type language. And so Jesus spoke of the temple reform, or the prophets rather spoke of temple reform, not liturgical reform, not ritual reform, but made it a point to stress the behavior of people, of wanting to get the people back to the covenant. One of the main purposes of prophets, and the prophets were usually sent first of all to the king, because the king represented the people. And one of the main jobs of the prophet was to get the people back to their covenant with God. Their primary purpose was not to look into a crystal ball and foresee something, although there is a lot of that in prophetic language. What they're doing is very interesting. And we're going to see Jesus doing this. The prophets, first of all, read the signs of the times. Okay, these were men, and biblically, men called by God, all right, to speak for God. And one of their jobs was to look at what's happening. And basically their message was, in general, if this keeps happening the way it's happening, this is what's going to happen. Okay? So it's not this directly looking into a crystal ball, but their foretellings, if you will, are rooted in what's happening now. If this continues the way it is, this is going to happen. Okay? There's also a reference here to back when we talked about the Maccabees last time, that Antiochus wanted to place his image, a statue of his image in the temple. All right? That's what provoked the rebellion of the Maccabees. So there was this influence of outsiders and outside influences into temple worship. So you have warnings against that, all right? But you also have the idea of don't forget love of God and love of neighbor. So it's not just fighting the externals, it's also encouraging you to get back to what we would call the two great commandments: love God and love your neighbor as yourself. So here, the temple, this is the second temple. All right? The first temple was destroyed in 539 BCE. This temple, the second temple, was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD or CE. And it's around the same time, around the 70s, where Mark was writing his gospel. And Mark, most scholars think he was writing from Rome for Christians living in Rome. Okay, so the very definite influence of the Romans at that point. So we have to ask ourselves, when Jesus speaks here, because you have Mark writing for his community, all right, there are a lot of questions coming up. What we're asking is, did Jesus actually predict the destruction of the temple? Or is the gospel looking back at the temple already destroyed and putting those prophetic words into Jesus' mouth? At this point, take a pick, because we're not absolutely sure. Don't forget, Mark's primary concern was to talk to his community, which is now in existence 40 some odd years after the resurrection and ascension. Okay? So they're the primary content. So the chapter begins by the disciples admiring the temple. All right? But Jesus comes out and says the things he said. Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down. We have to understand, based on what we saw last time, is Jesus is not angry at the temple. Jesus is not cursing the temple. That man was a Jew. Okay? What he was screaming and railing against was the immoral behavior that was connected to it. And Jesus, when he spoke about the destruction of the temple, and this is very important, always has reform in his mind. Things will always be reformed later on at some point. Okay, so we'll see. So, in verse 4, in verse 3, when he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, one of my favorite spots in all of the Holy Land, besides the Sea of Galilee, sitting on the Mount of Olives overlooking Jerusalem is one of the most peaceful places, and yet so filled with our understanding of what was going to happen in Jerusalem. All right? And Jesus and his disciples spent a lot of time on the Mount of Olives. All right? Peter, James, and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us when this will be, and what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them. Jesus does not answer their question right away. Okay? He answers their question in verse 32. What he begins to do is now to talk about their behavior. So, many will come, Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs. The language that Jesus uses here and that Mark kind of puts in his mouth, or what Jesus actually says, are just cliches. They are things that were commonly spoken about in Jewish circles about the time to come. Okay? We still use them, all right? But this is not a direct prophecy, but it's the cliches that the people of the time understood the end times would be like. But the last verse there is very important. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs. Now, most of us would say, oh my God, there's stuff worse to come, because, we're going to give birth now to even more disasters. But the interesting thing is, when you're talking about birth pangs, what follows birth pangs? New life. So Jesus is not predicting things would get any worse. He's saying to them, these are the birth pangs, but if you can get through them, you will experience, or there will be experienced, a new birth. So what Jesus is saying to his followers, just like we saw in the book of Revelation, we're going to cut, whoever we are, we're going to cut the persecutions short. Okay? So that's because when birth is given in Jewish symbolism, birth represents the kingdom of God, the new birth. Okay? So, he goes on. As for yourselves, beware, for they will hand you over to councils, and you will stand before governors and kings because of me as a testimony to them. And the good news must first be proclaimed to all nations. When they bring you to trial and hand you over, do not worry beforehand about what you are to say, but say whatever is given you at the time, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all because of my name, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Well, again, in this section, Jesus again is using apocalyptic language. All right? He's just using the cliches of the time. But if you notice here, and this is the other thing we have to keep in mind, most of the stuff that we read, that we just read, does not pertain to the time of Jesus. Okay? Because the persecutions are not happening at the time of Jesus. So, for example, Jesus' relationship with the Pharisees was pretty good when Jesus lived. All right? There were a few rotten apples, but Jesus had a very good relationship with the Pharisees. It wasn't until later, when the controversies began, that the Pharisees and the other members of Jewish groups began to persecute the Christians. So a lot of what we just read has to do with Mark's time, around the year 70. So he's taking the message of Jesus and the language of the apocalypse and applying it to the people of his time. All right? Because they had not been persecuted. They weren't being persecuted yet at the time of Jesus. All right? Granted, Jesus was considered a danger, but there were no Christians. Jesus never met a Christian in his life. Okay? Jesus was a Jew throughout, and we have to understand that. Okay? So actually, Jesus is talking to his followers about that. Okay. Verse 14. Now here we have references to the Old Testament to the prophecy of Daniel. But when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. What he's making reference to is from the book of Daniel. Daniel is making reference to the setting up of the statues and the images in the first temple. Okay? As kind of a forbearing of what's going to happen. Okay? And so Jesus, again, using this apocalyptic language, is basically saying, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. Someone on a housetop must not go down or enter the house or take anything away, and so on and so forth. All right? I'll skip down to verse 19. For in those days there will be suffering, such as not have been seen from the beginning of the creation that God created until now, and never will be. Those are words of Daniel coming out of the mouth of Jesus. All right. And if the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would be saved, but for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he has cut short those days. So again, what we see now, as we did in the book of Revelation, the persecutions will not continue on and on. The mercy of God will come and cut short those days, and those who are committed to Jesus will be saved. Go on. And if the Lord had not cut short, and if anyone says to you at that time, look, here is the Messiah, or look, there he is, do not believe it. False messiahs and false prophets will appear and produce signs and omens to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be alert, I have already told you everything. So Jesus is saying, and by the way, the whole message of chapter 13 is not so much the specifics of these prophecies, if you will. The whole purpose is to let the people know, both in his time and in the time of Mark, watch, beware. All right, that's the key to chapter 13. If you remember nothing else about these, the whole idea of being alert, watching, be on guard. Okay. We have the other thing that's very interesting in Jesus' time, and I think, I'm not quite sure how this fits in yet, but in most of the apocalyptic language, in the final battle, you have the battles between good and evil. In Mark's rendering of Jesus talking about the end times, there's no talk about the battle between good and evil. What is spoken of is that creation is going to be shaken, which is a reforming concept. Gary will explain a little bit of that later. All right, the shaking of creation. All right. So Jesus, again, after all of these, is telling people, watch, but things are going to be better. Okay. Now we go back to this poor fig tree. All right, as if you remember from the last session, Jesus does something which seems out of the ordinary. He sees a fig tree. It's not fig season. The leaves are just coming out, and he curses it. The day later, he passes by the fig tree, and the fig tree is withered. The language used there, withered, brings to mind some of the miracles that Jesus had done. He cured a man with a withered arm. But what did he do? He cured the man. So all of a sudden, he's got this shriveled up fig tree. But when Peter, back to the last chapter, when Peter asks him what happened, Jesus says to Peter, strange answer, have faith. Have faith in what? Have faith that that tree will come back to life. That things will get better. Well, guess what happens here? From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all of these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So he's basically saying to them, take a lesson, because the fig tree is coming back. Okay. And then from verses 32 on, he's basically saying to them, beware, watch. Okay. But let's get into chapter 14, which is interesting because there are plenty of images, and the symbolism here is off the charts. Okay, so and many of these images you will remember. Okay, so Mark starts off, and the theme of this chapter is betrayal. Okay, so we've had a theme of watchfulness in 13. We now have the message of betrayal in 14. Right? And we're only going to go up to verse 22 here. Next time we'll deal with the Eucharist and then move on to the Passion of Jesus. But let's take a look at verses 1 and 2. It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. They're both the same, Passover and the feast of the unleavened bread. Okay? The chief priests and the scribes. Now, they are your enemies, if you will, the enemies of Jesus. Not the Pharisees here, interestingly enough. The chief priests and the scribes, all right, were the ones who were pushing for the arrest and persecution and death of Jesus. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. For they said, not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people. First of all, the word that is used to translate it here as arrest has a better meaning in Greek, which means to kidnap. All right? They weren't looking to arrest Jesus because that would be very public. They were looking for a way, as we would say, to kidnap him and move him stealthily out of the way, secretly out of the way. Okay. There's also, interestingly, in these two verses, a tension that Mark brings out. The tension between, between the feast itself, which is a feast of what? A feast of liberation and freedom, versus the plot against Jesus. So there's your first tension. Second tension is between the temple authorities, all right, who are the scribes and Pharisees and temple guards and so on, and the people. The temple authorities want to arrest Jesus, but they won't do it because they're afraid of the people. So there's a tension there. How do we go about this? We can't do it publicly because there'll be a revolt. And by the way, at the time of Passover, that was one of the biggest fears of the Roman authorities, to keep peace. They were so afraid that revolts would explode. All right? So you don't want to do anything to upset the people. All right. Now, interesting incident here. Well, he was at Bethany. Now, Bethany became kind of his home when he was in the Jerusalem area. Bethany was about 2 miles from Jerusalem. All right. It was also the village where Martha, Mary, and Lazarus lived. Okay. While he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper. Now, this is interesting. He's in the house of this person, Simon the leper. We'll talk about him in a minute. As he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. But some were there who said to one another in anger, "Why was the ointment wasted in this way? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and the money given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has performed a good service for me." Okay, so right away, the woman is put in light of service and being a good servant. "For you always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Truly I tell you, whenever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, all she has done will be told in remembrance of her." Now let me ask you a question. All right, I'm going to work backwards here. Come Holy Week, come the time before Jesus is crucified, how much do we hear in our own liturgies, in our own scriptural readings, about this woman who anointed Jesus, who was proclaimed to be remembered for all times? And how often do we hear about the betrayal of Judas? There seems to be a disconnect here. Okay? We're more obsessed with Judas betraying Jesus than we are about an incident where Jesus actually tells us what this woman has done will be remembered for all times whenever the good news is proclaimed. What have we done wrong? I mean, what is this obsession with Judas's betrayal versus the positive gift that this woman is now giving to Jesus? That's what should be proclaimed at this time, not the betrayal of Judas. And yet in our liturgies and our readings, we skip over the anointing or we mention it. But in the gospel where it's mentioned, we're told when we read it during Holy Week that we can skip that section and we can use a shorter version. What's going on? Okay. So anyway, Simon the leper, who is he? Is he an actual leper? And if he's an actual leper, why is he holding social gatherings when he should be out there not bothering anybody? Or is he a cured leper? Was he the leper that Jesus cured in the beginning of the gospel? All right, but he was in his home. The woman is unnamed. All right, in Mark's gospel. Some have said it was Mary Magdalene. If it was anybody, it would have been Mary, Lazarus' sister. But Mark, it's very interesting, just doesn't name the woman. Okay? And what she has done would be part of the good news. All right? Now, the symbolism of the alabaster jar and this ointment of nard. All right? In some instances, the ointment is called spikenard. Okay? The word dealing with the genuineness of this ointment are very hard to translate because the word used for genuine can mean one of two things. The word itself looks like it comes from a word meaning faith. So could we say a woman bearing the costly oil of faith on the one hand, or it can carry the meaning of the Latin name for spikenard. All right? Again, something interesting. But what then becomes important is the symbolic or the actual actions of this woman. So, alabaster, a precious, precious stone, if you will, or material, containing this precious, precious oil. All right? The woman, we're told, breaks the jar and pours out the oil. two very, very important words: to break and to pour out. All right? In this instance, the word for break means to shatter, not just to break, but to shatter or destroy. Okay? What is the meaning of this action? To pour means to pour out. And how often have we heard that expression used in the context of sacrificial offerings? The blood of the victim is poured out. The expression is used about Jesus at the Last Supper, pouring out his blood. Okay. Does Mark see the woman breaking and pouring out anticipate Jesus at the Last Supper? Okay. We think, because Jesus says it, this is symbolic of his being anointed for burial. And here's where we run into some interesting concepts. What does this idea of anointing mean? What does it bring out? It says, anointing could be meaning consecrating the body for death. But we know that Jesus has been referred to as the Messiah, and the word Messiah means anointed one, who is someone sent to do God's work. And the idea of Messiah was also associated with the idea of glory. Okay? But one of the things Jesus wants to get through to people, he is not to be understood as the Messiah that is being waited for by the Jewish people. All right? His understanding and what he wants the people, his followers, to understand, that Jesus as Messiah is talking about a Messiah who must suffer and die for the people. All right? So that's the context. That's why Jesus doesn't want people to be proclaiming him to be the Son of God or Messiah, because his idea of Messiah is to be a suffering servant, as Isaiah would call it. Okay? So here, Jesus becomes the anointed one in the context of death. He's being anointed for his death, which ties into pouring out his blood and dying. Mark makes the woman's gestures anticipate Eucharistic gestures. What does Jesus do in establishing the Eucharist? All right? He breaks and he says, his blood will be poured out. Okay. And this is something to me which I find alarmingly, people are not really conscious of it. In the context of the Eucharist, in the context of this incident, when in the Eucharistic sections we hear, do this in remembrance of me, what do we do in remembrance of him? What does that mean? I think this points to exactly what it means. It means when you receive the Eucharist, when you think of Eucharist, all right, you must think about not some memory of something that happened in the past, first of all, but you must think about something that must be relived. And it's not just coming together to sit and gawk at a host. Okay? When we think of do this in memory of me, do what? And the two words that come to mind, to break and to pour out. All right? What Eucharist symbolizes for us, when we're told to do this in remembrance of Jesus, it means we must pour out of ourselves and we must break ourselves. Okay? We must offer our bodies and blood the same way Jesus did. It's not some memory, nice memory that we keep in mind. And that's why I believe that in the context of Eucharist in Christianity, you're dealing with something I call dangerous memory. A memory which demands a risk So when you hear the words, do this in memory of me, what are we risking? We're not risking going up and receiving a host and coming back and thanking Jesus and then go out and wait till next Sunday to receive communion again. The idea of Eucharist is, what am I risking? I am risking letting go, giving of myself in remembrance of what Jesus did. You have to relive the memory. And I think that that's very, very important. And I think that's really what the idea was right from the beginning. All right? I think in the course of history, we've kind of sterilized our liturgy. All right? So the final thing I want to mention, again, is the symbolism. All right? And we kind of look at, on the first day of unleavened bread, I'm looking at 14, verse 12. On the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, his disciples said to him, where do you want us to go and make the preparations for you to eat the Passover? So he sent two of his disciples, saying to them, go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Now remember, in the other Gospels, we have him meeting up and being told to find this donkey that was tied up. Here, he's talking about they'll find a man carrying a jug of water. Keep in mind the word jug and water. And wherever he enters, say to the owner of the house, the teacher asks, where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us here. So the disciples set out and went to the city and found everything as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover meal. Interesting symbolism. These details, there are no names, no places specific named. All right, it's kind of left open so that we can kind of read the symbolism here. And the narrative, there's no concreteness in this narrative. It's kind of broad. There is the idea that Passover, preparing for Passover, is the feast of the unleavened bread, okay, which is significant to a Eucharistic commitment. Now, don't forget, we're now talking about perhaps symbolism dealing with Eucharist, too. So the feast of the unleavened bread brings to mind the Eucharistic celebration. The day they sacrificed the Passover lamb has sacrificial implications of the meal to come. So, we say that Jesus offered and sacrificed himself. But here you have again, symbolism. You have a man carrying a plaster jar of water. Before, we had a woman carrying an alabaster jar of precious ointment. Okay? Parallels. What is the symbolism of the parallel? Could it be symbolism of the meeting between humanity and divinity? The precious and the natural. Again, that's why I hate dealing with symbols, because I'm an Italian and you need a Jew or an Irishman to deal with this stuff because they're great storytellers. They have imaginations that just burst forth. Right? I'm more interested in pasta and, things Italian, pizza, things like that. So, again, but play with the symbols. Look deeper, all right? Put on the mind of Christ. Just don't take anything superficially, as we keep saying. If you want to get deeper, you have to put on the mind of Christ. Not do what Jesus did, not yet. Because you're not going to know what Jesus did until you have his attitude. Then you'll be able to read the signs of the times and then do something about it. So I leave you with that, and I leave all of this symbolism and good stuff to our friend the rabbi. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. We just came back. I had a class in the synagogue about the end of life ethics in Judaism and what you need to know about it. And I think it always comes down to the Torah, the scripture, basically tries to tell us there's a body of life here, and you have to treat it respectfully. Whether it's a human, animal, it doesn't matter. There's a body of life. We can't create life. We are brought into life. So respect the force that creates the life that we're part of. We're not going to get into the end of life ideas in Judaism, but I can tell you that it really intersects with our ideas today. Because when life ends for us on earth, for Judaism, and of course for what the Christianity stands for, is that it doesn't end altogether. There's a body that we live in, and there's something else that somehow continues. And really, this is the focus. Yesterday, we read in the synagogue about the 3 last plagues that God had to strike Egypt with because they didn't understand something. And the message that they didn't understand, and this is what we'll look at today, is that what Jesus walked into the temple and he said, okay, I tried to cleanse it. Last month we finished when Jesus attempts to cleanse the temple. But if that fails, we have to destroy the temple. We have to destroy the body. We have to show the Egyptians on a global level that nature is not all. That there's a hand that created nature. We have to show those who worship in the temple that the body, the temple itself, is not the end goal. The Egyptians believed in nature. Nature is very powerful. To have a big house, to have a structure that protects you from the elements, it's very powerful. Nature is powerful. That's paganism. If you worship nature, that's paganism. Paganism had a lot of wisdom because they knew the patterns of nature. But they were missing one thing. And this is the one thing that the Egyptians missed and did not want to go there. Pharaoh had to get 10 strikes and still didn't understand it. Couldn't make the jump from nature to the hand that moves nature. The outstretched arm of God in the story of Passover is the whole idea, is the miracle that we couldn't leave Egypt by ourselves. We needed that mysterious hand to take us out of Egypt. God, in a sense, had to show Pharaoh how he shakes nature, how he breaks the bottle to take the ointment out. This is the story of Passover. This is why this is happening on Passover, even in the New Testament, because that is the message. And that is the message that gives birth to Judaism. Judaism was born out of the story of Egypt. Because our Bible also tells us in Proverbs, the first step to wisdom is to understand, is to recognize God. If you don't recognize God, then nothing, you can't build anything on nothing. If you don't have a basis to build your wisdom. Which means that if you look at nature and you say, this is it, you're missing the point. We take for granted that nature, that heaven and earth is going to be there when we wake up every morning. But who said so? In a sense, on a global level, this is the temple. It's the temple that God created in order for us to be able to meet. The original purpose of the temple, and this is why that temple, those stones will not stay together, because if it loses the basis on which it stands, it's going to be destroyed. And the basis that it's built on is the meeting, is the community, is justice, community of justice. And once this is gone, the building itself cannot survive. In Egypt, if you enslave everybody in order to protect your structure, it's not going to last. At the same time as the story of Jesus happened, just a little bit after the time that the Gospel of Mark is written, during the destruction of the temple, just before and after, something else was born. Rabbinic Judaism. And Rabbinic Judaism basically says the same thing. And we have a story in the Talmud about Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. He was a famous rabbi who was one of the main contributors to the oral tradition that we today live by. We don't have a temple for 2,000 years now. We haven't had a temple. But what we have is Rabbinic Judaism, is the message that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, when he said to, back then, the military commander Vespasian, who was in charge of the siege of Jerusalem, just before the temple was destroyed, he somehow orchestrated his own death, and so he could leave the old city, the walls of the city of Jerusalem, and go and meet with Vespasian. And he comes to him and he says to him, whether it's exactly, word for word, but the message is there. He said, I saw in the Holy Spirit that you will be the next emperor of Rome. And at that point, Vespasian wanted to kill him. He said, how dare you tell me something like that? Because when you tell something like that to a general, it means that he's somehow maybe constructing a mutiny against the Roman emperor, and then he would be killed. But he said, as they were speaking, a message came from Rome that the emperor died and he is appointed to be the next emperor. And so he was amazed, of course, and he asked Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, he said to him, tell me anything you want, I will give it to you. And what would you expect the rabbi to ask the new emperor of Rome? Save Jerusalem. Save the temple. But he didn't. He asked, give me Yavne. Yavne is the city, and its wise men. Meaning the Sanhedrin. He wanted to move the Sanhedrin from Jerusalem to Yavne. The Sanhedrin was the basis of the law, of the Jewish teaching. And he knew that at that point, the attempt to cleanse the temple was unsuccessful. And if Judaism continues to see the temple, the structure, as primary and the community as secondary, they're missing the point. God in Hosea tells us, I want mercy. I want basically justice. I don't want your sacrifices. That's what I want. And all the rest of the prophets echo the same message. God does not want our offering if they don't come in the context of justice. If you don't really want to repent, God does not want that. When King David wanted to build a temple, up until then, it was still the tent of meeting that was constructed in the desert. A tent, it's a tent. The point is the meeting of a community, and of course with God. And the prophet Nathan came back to him and said, God is not interested in you building him a beautiful cedar building. He not interested. He told me, I am actually enjoying the fact that I can move around between the tribes, visit my children, and I don't need it. In a sense, building a temple, a stationary temple for God was a compromise. It's just as we were talking about last time, that it was a compromise for God to agree that the people of Israel will appoint a king, flesh and blood. God is the king. Why would you need a person that, remember, will increase horses, will increase property, will take your children to be slaves, and basically return you to Egypt? You just came out of Egypt. Those people who believed in nature, in the power of the body versus the power of the spirit. So in a sense, a temple, a stationary temple, is a compromise. Because actually one of the names for God is Hamakom. Hamakom, the place. God is the place of meeting. When you create a physical place, just like you're creating a physical king, it comes with issues. You start on a regular basis, your daily life is about fixing the building, making sure the building is protected. But what about the congregation? What about the people, the justice? If that becomes just a front, then it's going to be destroyed. And that's what Jesus said. You look at this, it's going to fall. Because the glue, the real cement, is not there. And that really is the point. So, in terms of the idea of the birth pangs, we have a term that is called the birth pangs of the Messiah. That is the idea that before the Messiah comes, or the time that the Messiah comes, will be very painful. It will be, for many people, it'll mean death. Because when we go back to the model of Egypt and the night of Passover, where after all the attempts to show the Egyptians, to educate that it's not just about the nature. Remember the image of Jesus riding on a donkey into Jesus that we talked about last time? Which is, of course, an image from Isaiah that means that the donkey is the material, but we have to ride it, not it riding us. And they didn't understand that part. So to transition from that, some people will have to die. They will not be able to survive that transition. And the death of the firstborn of the Egyptian, or anybody for that matter, who did not put the blood on the doorpost to signify to the angel of death, I am ready for a new life. That I know that there's something on the other side. This reality is not the end of all. There's something beyond that. And those who were willing to put the blood on the doorpost, when it went through, passed over. They also passed over. Not just that the angel of death passed over their houses, but that they were able to pass through, pass over. And what does that essentially mean? And we'll conclude with that idea because it really is the basis for everything, is that there's life after death. That there's life after death. The greatest symbolism of the life after death is, of course, Christianity is all built on that idea. But for Jews, is that the death of the firstborn in Egypt became the beginning of life for Judaism. The shattering of the bottle of the body and getting that blood, the ointment, became now the basis for life in Judaism. The firstborn, all the firstborns have to be redeemed. And they have to buy their lives from God. So that understanding is the basis for everything. That your life, your firstborn, the beginning of your life, is really not the physical. You owe that to a spiritual transition. That something had to die for you to live. And really, this is the main point and symbolism. It starts with the conversation about the temple and that the temple will be destroyed and something else will come after that. Rabbinic Judaism says the same thing. You put too much emphasis on that bottle, on that bottle, the temple. It needs to shatter. It needs to go through. Egypt, nature versus the hand of God. And this is how we begin our ritual life in Judaism. It starts on Passover, not Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah was the head of the year for taxes. But the ritual year begins, the Torah calls the first month the month of Passover. This is when we begin. And we begin with the belief in leaving Egypt because of that mysterious hand that will bring us to the other side, the strong arm and the outstretched, the strong hand and the outstretched arm. Amen.
Before we open up for questions, I just want to wish Rabbi Gadi and Father Roy a safe and holy trip to the Holy Land, which is coming up in 2 weeks. So we wish him well.
It's actually, I'm leaving in 2 weeks, a week before, just to make sure everything goes well, because of all the symbolisms that we talked about last month that has to do with our trip. But the group leaves on February 23rd, so 3 weeks from today. If anybody still wants to join us, even after I told you that on the day of the Israeli election, we will be on Temple Mount. Whatever.
Now we'll see the right hand of God. But good, all the best. Blessings. And again, I just want to, this is a commercial. The Greenport Ecumenical Ministries every year during Lent has a series of Lenten talks in 5 different churches by 5 different ministers. So we're going to continue to do that again this year. So, and we'll post. I'll try to get things posted here if anybody is interested. And then the last of the weeks is a model Seder, to which all are welcome. A model Seder at the synagogue.
April 8th.
April
at
8th.
11 a.m.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Of course. As an Italian, I forget the food. Yes. After every one of the Lenten sermons, there will be a Lenten lunch. Okay, so you're all welcome. There's no cost. Well, they're all over. So again, we'll send out the schedules. Okay, but they will come out. I will send them out to the parishes and to the churches this week. Okay. Any questions? One of the things I want to bring up is, and it's something that when I was studying, what Gotti said, one of the first elements is to be able to recognize God. Now, we hear that word and it kind of passes by, but at one point I was doing a study of the meaning of the word knowledge in biblical terms. And the word knowledge, first of all, and we know this from the Gospels when Mary says, I know not man. The idea of knowing biblically is a whole bodily, mental process. Knowledge demands and presupposes intimacy. Okay. But the very interesting thing about it is, as opposed to that, you have the knowledge that we very often talk about. And, we talk about people who know God. They have knowledge of God. But I would raise the questions, do they recognize God? And there's a big difference. All right? Recognize demands, well, let's put it this way, okay? None of you know my brother. So my brother goes off, the prodigal son. Okay? And he decides to come back. And you know I have a brother. Okay? And you see him coming back and you say, oh, he's Don's brother. I see him come back. He's not just my brother. I recognize him. My recognition of my brother demands a depth of knowledge that the mind escapes. So when we talk, and the rabbi talks about recognizing God, especially in the context of the word knowledge, biblical understanding of knowledge, it means that we just don't know God, but that somehow there is a true recognition internally that that's God. And that's why the experience of God is so important. That's why the Jews, their practically first historical moment in terms of Exodus was the experience of salvation. They recognized that this hand was involved here. They just didn't know this God. They may have known this God, but now they had first-hand experience. And recognition demands a certain amount of experience. So when we talk about knowing God, we're really talking about not just mental knowledge, but experiential knowledge. And that's why, if you're looking at the thrust of the Gospels in the New Testament, it keeps coming back over and over again. Jesus is basically demanding, if we're going to recognize God, Jesus is demanding in the Gospels that we see differently. That we have to change the way we see in order to recognize God. All right. It's not ideological. And we see that today. Everybody's speaking for God. He's God. He was sent by God. No, she was sent by God. It's all ideological and mental. How do we as Christians recognize God? Talked about the building, the temple building. Well, we're beginning to see the shattering of that building in the Catholic Church with regard to its institution. Now, I say this not because I'm denying institution, but if we go back and look at Vatican Council II, institution was only one of the models for the church. But somehow we gravitate to the institution, to the stones, to the building, and we neglect all of these other ideas of the church. So I think experientially, we're seeing a lot of the shattering of those walls in our own institution. All right? And what is that forcing us to do? It's forcing us to go back, to go beyond the institution and recognize the God who somehow this institution has to recognize. So all of those things are kind of coming into play at this point. Any questions?
There's a beautiful image of the temple there's a midrash, and you can see that I think you can actually see it I'm going to make sure this time when I go to the temple. Some of the ideas that the windows in the temple were, you know how when you have a building that you're trying to defend yourself from the outside, then the windows were narrower on the outside and wider on the inside, so you can see what's going outside but be protected, or later on you can use a rifle, right? You can stand and shoot out. So the Midrash says that the windows of the temple were reversed, actually. They were narrow on the inside and wide on the outside, that the light would shine out. So it's technical, but it means the idea of the purpose of that building. The purpose of that building was not to protect itself, but actually to shine light out. And that is the philosophical difference. That's a beautiful image.
Great image.
That we actually, Sabrina is saying that narrow window on the inside is actually to concentrate on looking inward. And when we're spiritual, absolutely, the look is inward, because we have to work on ourselves before we tell other people how to be. And of course, the model of Egypt was to be on top of people and to tell them how to live their lives, right? Instead of concentrating on ourselves. And it's in our sources that said that it's easier to conquer a city than conquering our own inclination.
And from the Christian, Jesus says we've got to enter through the narrow gate. So again, that idea of moving inward, coming to that.
What is the word?
She said, why did the Jewish people still want to build a temple?
Very good question. Why do the Jewish people still want to build a temple? If we know all that, why do we want it? So actually, the basis for our proposal that we take to Israel, it's called From Egypt to Rehoboth. And I think I've explained it a couple of times, but Egypt in Hebrew means narrow, and Rehoboth means wide. Egypt is the place that basically gave birth to the Jewish people, so that's where it starts. And Rehoboth means it's the name of the third temple. According to Midrashim, it symbolizes the third temple. So I happen to be from the town of Rehoboth in Israel. Rehoboth, like Rehoboth, Maryland. I'm from Rehoboth, Israel. It's not an Indian name, as people think it is. But what it means is the journey, the spiritual journey, is from Egypt to Rehoboth, is from narrow to wide. So the idea is that you get out of Egypt always. It's a constant mission to get out of Egypt, making sure you're not on top of anybody and nobody's on top of you, that you're not a slave for anything or anybody, or you don't become the Pharaoh, right? So, and the idea of the movement is that shoulder to shoulder. The prophets tell us that at the end of the days, even the non-Jews will come and worship in the temple shoulder to shoulder. So the movement is from narrow to wide, from being narrow-minded to wide-minded too. So you accept more, it's diverse. So actually the proposal that we wrote suggests that we don't need to build a temple. That where the Jewish people today worship at the Western Wall, where they all come together, all colors, all shapes, men, women, Jews, non-Jews, with the intention, really with the prayer intention, and not just bringing a sacrifice just to show people, oh, look, I brought a sacrifice, I'm repentant. No, there's the situation that the Jewish people today go to the Western Wall is actually the ultimate situation that the prophets preached about forever. So we actually say nobody moves. That we can do as is, that could be the temple. We actually do not need a structure. Originally I thought, well, maybe we could just put a roof on. And then I thought to myself, we don't even need a roof on. If we want, we can put a tent, just like it was the tent of meeting. But the purpose of meeting was achieved. Everybody meets at the Western Wall. It's beautiful. So in a sense, some people would say, no, we still want to strive to build a temple. But so many Jews said, no, we don't actually need it. The location, historically, theologically, you can say is where it is. So we're not going to change that. But in terms of the purpose of it, we can be as is. It could be considered the third temple.
And, it's interesting, too. In today's day and age, we see, especially in times of contention, we see what happens to buildings. The Twin Towers, all right? The vulnerability of a building, all right? So, I would ask, all right, are the Jews willing to take that risk to build another thing just to have it blown up and have all of this questioning go on? Or is the vision that we have of the inclusiveness, is that more important than a structure which somebody who hates us can just blow up? And we go through, and then we spend more time worrying about the building being rebuilt than we do about the people who are there together.
Yeah, I would even extend it to the image of the kingship. So let's say from the Jewish perspective, the Messiah comes tomorrow, and he's from the house of David, and now he's going to be the king, right? Kingship is never going to look the same as it looked back then. We're not going to have, the Jewish people are not going to have another king with those horses and the carriage. It's not going to happen. That king, like the definition originally in the Bible, that basically that's going to be a scholar, a Torah scholar, a person that will dedicate their lives to writing Torah scroll, not to, engage in battles and, that you leave to, politicians, to other people. But actually, the kingship is going to look differently too. And it's amazing, the process that the royal family is going through in England is very interesting. That, when eventually you can't cheat, if the relationship within that structure is unhealthy, it's doomed to dissolve. So you're going to have the Buckingham Palace. That's very nice. It's going to be a beautiful building. But as a royal family that is giving example of how to be and how to live, if the relationship between the family is unhealthy, it's not going to last. Not that I have anything against a royal family. I actually think If you ask me if I'm which side I am in England, to keep the royal family or not, I would say definitely keep the royal family. I think it's a beautiful example of tradition, of something that it's very cumbersome to hold on to that kind of history and tradition. So they work hard. I don't care how many homes they have and how many times they take vacations a year. They work very hard just being the royal family. But they have to do it in a way that also moves with the time, to see the signs of the time, and that it will last.
I think one of the great challenges that we have, what Scotty was talking, and one of the things that I think has bogged us down theologically and biblically, and it's one of the great challenges, I think, to biblical scholars and to religions. Okay, how do you keep the best of the tradition and begin to understand yourselves in terms of a new cosmology, in terms of a universe which is expanding, which is not stable? All right, we've come out of a biblical tradition, a cultural tradition where we see things as being static. Let me give you an example. Martin Luther's famous hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." Well, that was the image, a mighty fortress. It's not a God who lives and expands. Right now, everything that science is telling us, the world is expanding. Okay, we're dealing with quantum physics. All right, and yet much of our mentality, even interpreting the scriptures, is rooted in a three-tiered world. All right, an underworld, the world where we are, and a world above. And I don't think that we've taken into consideration enough of where the world is going and growing. All right, there's a development of conscience, of consciousness that we're going beyond. All right, and we're beginning to see it in. I think there's a tendency there. We see the young people moving out of the institutional mold. All right, I don't think that's accidental. I think that there is something imbued in them, just like when my son was born, where he learned to put Legos together and work computers, and which I don't understand at all. But there's something imbued in them which sees something much broader. And let's face it, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. No matter how hard we try, no matter how much screaming and preaching that we've got to bring back the old days, it'll never happen. It's too much toothpaste out of the tube to put back. So how do you keep the tradition, not custom, difference? How do you keep the true tradition of Christianity, the biblical tradition, and understand it in the context of a universe which is totally expanding, not collapsing? Well, I can answer his question. First of all, it doesn't say the layperson. It says all of the people. Okay, so you're dealing with clergy and laity. Okay.
Maybe you should repeat the question.
In other words, Jack is asking, what do you mean? What do we mean when we talk about institution? Okay, and in the definition, I brought up the definitions from Vatican II, that there were 5 models of the church that were understood and talked about in the documents, and one of them was institution. But there were 4 others. But we have become focused in on this idea of institution. At base, okay, the church is defined as the whole people of God. All right, not just laity, not just clergy. Okay. What we mean by institution is the hierarchical structure. Okay. Unfortunately, there is a difference between a hierarchical structure and a pyramidal structure. And we have been living, yes. We have a hierarchy. But we also have been living under the burden of this pyramid. And we are the slaves, if you will, the lay people, the slaves at the bottom of the pyramid. And this present Pope, when he's talking about, and he's a wise man, he's talking about what is wrong with this structure. And what he's saying is we have placed too much emphasis on the clerical element of the structure. So when we talk about institution, we're talking about that structure and the way things are governed, all right? I mean, and politically too, okay? So, I mean, that's where we're coming from. But it's only one of 5, and probably many more, models of the church. But it's one that we feel safest in. It's interesting. We tend to lean towards security rather than freedom. All right? And we move to what is safe, all right, rather than what is freeing.
Right. So a building would give us that false feeling of security, when the real security is the sukkah, really the tabernacle, under the God, the providence of God. Because, you know, I in my 47 years of life, I've seen all kinds of, I know, around here. I've seen all these people who had a lot of money, a lot of security, and securities, but then God decides that game's over. So we cannot protect ourselves ultimately from the hand of God. And I would say that the same thing. I was going to say basically the same thing. Even in the corporate environment today, when I was working in the corporate environment, they were talking about basically flattening the pyramid. Kind of trying to, the open door policy, that you don't feel that your boss is, your boss's boss is in the heavens. They're here on earth, and you can walk into their office. So it's a different mindset. So the temple, destruction of the temple is the destruction really not just of the building, is the destruction of that institution, that hierarchical institution that felt like a pyramid, that there were masters and slaves, there are kings and slaves, and that is gone. So from doing this, the hierarchy of a Kohen, a Levi, the priests shouldn't be. The image that we should have in our mind is not like a pyramid. They stand here and everybody is below, but as a concentric circle that we surround, just like the tribes were surrounding the Ark of the Covenant. That is the structure that we want to have, and that's a wide structure. So it comes from a center and moving out. That is the image, and when we do that, then you get a wide base, a diverse base, that our rabbis tell us that third temple will not be destroyed like the previous two, because it stands on not just a physical wide base, but a mental and spiritual wide base.
And to me, the institution, what is most important to the institution is leadership. Right? And I think we can see in today's church with Pope Francis, right, why he's causing people to feel ill at ease. Because most of us in our lifetime have never experienced a pope like him. We have a set idea in our minds of what a pope is. The images of John Paul II, of Benedict, of Pius XII, all right? And they represent a centralizing idea, okay, of strong, let's break down the walls and go orthodoxy. Whereas the Pope we have now, we have never experienced a leader as we are experiencing him, all right? And that, to me, that's why we feel uncomfortable, because we have a set image of mind of what a leader should be. All right? They were centrists. All right? Francis is a visionary. He's a pastor. We'd much rather him crack the whip and get everybody together Orthodox-wise. All right? But if you look at the way he's dealing with the church government, with all of these bishop synods and so on, he has a vision of the universality of the church. We've never experienced a pope like that, and that's why it's a little bit uneasy.
Yeah, last question.
Yes, and I agree with you totally. But what I'm saying is there is a very strong movement in the church, especially in the church in the United States, which is very anti-Francis. Not among the lay people, but among the bishops, all right, regardless of what they say, and among the rich organizations, okay? And they are financing this development which is anti-Francis. The people, and that's another indication of the church. It's the people who are comfortable with him. It's the people who sense that, yes, this is the church in the way it should be. And those who are more authoritarian are afraid.
We'll end with maybe one thought that, again, going back to the reading of the plagues in Egypt, there was a progression in those 10 plagues, and at a certain point, the magicians and advisors of Pharaoh tell him, can't you see that Egypt is gone? Why don't you stop with your, authority and structural authority and let it, develop? And he's stubborn, right? And Egypt eventually falls. But it's the same idea as there was the temple in the first century, that there were these group of people that were just not letting go of the structure. And that's why Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had to leave and say, okay, that structure is going to fall. So, I don't know well enough the structure of the church, but any structure with this kind of hierarchy and tradition has to know it has to evolve and has to be more wider than narrower. Thank you very much.
The next meeting day is March 22nd, and the final meeting day for Mark's Gospel is April 5th. Okay, and that comes a week before Easter, and we will be talking about the death and resurrection of Jesus on the 5th.